Bill.
Mr. Commissioner, I have Mr. Taylor with a 45-minute estimate.
Mitchell Taylor for the participant Government of Canada, and with me is Jonah Spiegelman. Mr. Carter, let me begin by turning your attention, if I may, to Exhibit 35, which is the 209 report of the Commissioner for Sustainable Development. That's tab 22, which has come up on your screen there. And if you, Mr. Bissett, would be so kind as to turn to a page that I can't give you, but it has recommendation 1.41 on it. Actually, I can. 25 in the real page numbering on the document. Now, Mr. Carter, you'll see, and I think Ms. DeCero took you to this as well, recommendation 1.41 at the top, which says that as a recommendation, Fisheries and Oceans should accelerate implementation of its habitat compliance decision framework to ensure there is an adequate risk-based approach to monitoring projects and providing assurance that proponents are complying with the Act and all terms and conditions of departmental decisions. And you're familiar with that recommendation, of course.
Yes, I am.
And that recommendation is similar to recommendations that had been made prior to that, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Now, you're the team leader for the Habitat Monitoring Unit. Is your role in your unit essentially a response to that recommendation?
Yes, I would say that it is.
And others like it as well.
Yes.
And what can you say about the department's approach to and response to that recommendation, and whether they embraced it and took it seriously? And what have they done, just at an overview level for the moment?
At an overview level, the Habitat Compliance Decision Framework as a policy document has been created, and it does exist, and it lays out the department's approach to when an identified occurrence or a non-compliance is found, how to respond to it in a risk-based approach. And also there has been the implementation of habitat monitoring staff across the country. So I think the response has been fairly substantive.
Summing up then, is it fair to say that your unit and the work that you do is in the Pacific region, and there's others like you elsewhere in the country, is operationalizing the recommendation that we just looked at?
I would say so, yes.
Now, the monitoring unit that you have in the Pacific region is something that's part of a national initiative to achieve improved monitoring and some national consistency, is it?
Yes, it is.
And why is it that national consistency is important?
I think it's important to have the consistency so that information that's gathered across the country can be combined or compared and can be used, and also the opportunity that when you learn something in one region, it can be applied to other regions as well. So I think the consistency is important.
And at the same time, what's your assessment as to whether you've got, speaking at an overview for the moment, sufficient flexibility to do in this region what you think needs to be done to adapt to local circumstances?
I would say we are being provided with an adequate amount of flexibility to try and tailor the monitoring that we're doing in this region to what's been identified as the priorities of this region. So we are being afforded a certain amount of flexibility.
You've outlined for Ms. DeCero in answers to her questions something of the structure in the Pacific region and where and how your unit situates within the regional structure and your reporting relationships with headquarters and your role and the number of staff, which essentially is 12 staff in your unit.
That's correct.
And in addition to your 12 staff, you have a certain directive function with regard to other habitat staff who are doing monitoring. Is that right?
I think I would call it a coordination function rather than a directing function.
Okay.
You know, but yes, we do coordinate the efforts that are being done by other Habitat staff as well as the monitoring staff.
And that would be other staff in the 5 area offices?
That's correct.
And am I correct that your 12 staff, some of those are in the 5 area offices, aren't they?
Yes, most of them are.
All right. And do those 12, or the number of those 12 in the area offices, do they work alongside with these other Habitat officers who are also doing some Habitat work?
Yes, they do.
Or doing some monitoring work?
Yes, they do. They work actively with the other staff, and you know, they are actually conducting monitoring jointly very often, and that part of that is beneficial because it ensures that, you know, the standards and the approaches that are being used by the monitoring staff can be conveyed to the Habitat staff in general, so that the monitoring, when it's done, is done again in a consistent fashion within the region.
Do you have a sense of the number of staff, in addition to the 12 that report directly to you? Do you have a sense of the number of Habitat staff in addition that do monitoring work, and how much of their time is spent on that?
I don't know that I could pull out an exact number for the Habitat staff in the region. I'd have to look at an org chart for that. It's, you know, going to be in the neighborhood of 60, 70, above that probably.
Did you say 6 or 7 or 60 or
60, but to be honest, I would have to look at the org chart to be sure of that number.
But that's kind of the range you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes.
All right. And do you know how much of their time, that staff time, is spent on monitoring?
The goal is 20%. What we have found is that the number tends to be lower. I think more, you know, in the neighborhood of 5%, somewhere in there. But there are continuing efforts to try and increase the amount of monitoring that's done by Habitat staff. So, and we're trying, as part of the monitoring unit, to facilitate that.
Can you explain for the commissioner the qualifications or skill sets that your 12 staff have, and any further training that they're given internally to do the work that's underway?
The habitat biologists that are involved, most of them are experienced habitat biologists that have been conducting referrals and reviewing projects for a number of years. So they have field experience in evaluating impacts, evaluating projects, quantifying habitat variables. And then there are a number of monitoring technicians who are experienced in field skills, doing the measurements, capturing samples, those sorts of skills. So they are a fairly skilled group, though we have a range. We have some staff who are relatively new to it, some staff who are very experienced. Most of them have been involved in project reviews.
Now, are you speaking of the 12 that report to you, or both
Yes.
those? Okay, and is there a different skill set in the Habitat staff who also do monitoring in addition to the 12, or are they largely the same kind of skill set?
I would say very similar skill sets. Within the monitoring unit, we did a lot of work this year as a group, where we went out and did case studies as a group and looked at how we would evaluate a particular situation or condition and how we would capture the information in order to build sort of consistency. So internally, we did a lot of work together. That the intent is that then that work, or the benefits of that work, would be conveyed to Habitat staff in the areas through the monitoring staff in the area.
When you say biologist and technician, am I correct that those are words that relate to federal government classifications?
That's correct.
And biologists, I take it, have biology degrees.
Yes.
Am I also correct, though, that technicians, some or all of them, have biology degrees?
Currently, for the technicians working in the Habitat monitoring unit, most have degrees. There are some that just have diplomas or certificates.
And what kind of diploma or certificate would that be?
Would be a college diploma or certificate in environmental studies of one form or another.
All right.
So.
Mr. Taylor, I apologize for interrupting, but before I forget, you mentioned to the witness the Habitat Compliance Decision Framework has been created. Has that already been marked as an exhibit?
I don't believe that has been marked. I think it was referred to but not brought up on the screen. It's one of the documents I think we have in our list of exhibits.
Is this the, what Mr. Carter at one point referred to as the picture? Is that, I don't recall myself speaking of it, so that's
Well,
why I
at the
might
very-
sound...
I apologize, sir. At the very outset of your questions, you took them to Exhibit 35 and 1.41 on page 25. And that was, you read him the Habitat Compliance Decision Framework that's mentioned.
Oh, right.
Yes.
I'm being told it's tab 2 of our binder. Let me just see what that is.
I do believe I mentioned that it was a policy document that had been created. So.
Mr. Bissett, are you able to bring up tab 2 of, thank you. Mr. Carter, I see what Mr. Commissioner is speaking of now. In 1.41, that recommendation from the Commissioner of Sustainable Development, it says to implement the Habitat Compliance Decision Framework. Is that the document that's now on the computer screen?
Yes, it is.
Okay. That is not an exhibit, Mr. Commissioner. I'm happy to have it marked as an exhibit. Recommendation 1.41 keeps coming up, and since it does refer to it, it's probably useful to have the document that the recommendation is referring to put in as an exhibit.
All right, and if I may just impose on you just for a moment, and I apologize again for interrupting, but I just want to make sure I understand. There was a Exhibit 677. I'm just a little confused as to how these documents relate, if they do at all.
And this is 677 up on the screen now. Can you, Mr.
I could
Carter?
probably explain the relationship between the two. And there is a little bit of confusion caused by the wording of that point 141, because the wording of 141 suggests that the Habitat Compliance Decision Framework will sort of lay out the monitoring initiative. But in reality, the Habitat Compliance Decision Framework is a policy document that lays out sort of a risk-based approach to an incident of non-compliance. So when non-compliance is identified, the Compliance Decision Framework lays out an approach to evaluating the risk associated with that non-compliance and then coming up with a response from the department. Whereas the National Habitat Monitoring Framework was a document talking more about developing a habitat monitoring initiative and what would be involved in monitoring. So I guess, the results of habitat monitoring would then feed into a compliance decision framework where when you identify non-compliance, now what do you do about it?
I think you're saying that the monitoring work and the left side of the computer screen is a document relating to that. The
Yes.
monitoring work is done and feeds into allowing compliance decision-making to occur.
Yes.
And compliance decision-making is within the context of the right side of the computer screen.
That would be correct.
The left side of the screen is currently an exhibit, although the number escapes me, 677, and the right side of the screen is not yet an exhibit, so I think it should be an exhibit at this point, if it could be the next one. That is the Habitat Compliance Decision Framework.
Marked as exhibit number 680.
And that is a 2007 document, isn't it?
That's correct.
And then just further on this, hopefully to assist the commissioner, I'm getting the sense, and I'll put it to you, but you correct it, or correct what I say, that recommendation 1.41 in the 2009 report of the Commissioner of Sustainable Development, Exhibit 35, when recommendation 1.41 uses the term Habitat Compliance Decision Framework, he or she has not quite got it right, because that's not exactly the framework that is speaking to monitoring.
That's correct.
Okay. Does that assist, Mr. Commissioner?
It's very helpful, Mr. Taylor, thank you. And there's just one other, and I apologize again, but I take you back to
No, that's fine.
1.41. Under the Fisheries and Ocean Canada's response, there's just another reference there to something, I just want to make sure I understand. The Habitat Compliance Modernization Initiative, is that something that the witness could just explain in terms of its relationship to these other exhibits?
Yes, I can.
Yes, can you outline for that? And meanwhile, while you're explaining it, I'll see if we find it.
Okay, the Habitat Compliance Modernization Initiative, which has been referred to as HCM fairly repeatedly, that was the 6th initiative under EPMP. That was the last initiative that was added. And under that HCM initiative, there are 3 elements, and they mainly have to do with compliance management. The first element was the protocols, which is the working relationship between CMP and Habitat, the roles and responsibilities document. The second element of HCM was the compliance management, or the compliance decision framework, and that was how you would make decisions about how to respond to non-compliance, the policy document. And then the third element of HCM was increasing capacity to do monitoring. And my main role falls in that third initiative of doing the monitoring.
All right, thank you. We hear a fair bit about modernization in the context of Habitat work. Can you briefly say what you understand to be meant by modernization? It's both
Yeah.
something to be done, and it seems to be a term of art as well, but what's your understanding of what it's all about?
Well, with regard to, I guess, the Habitat Compliance Modernization, the main element with regards to compliance had to do with the Habitat Compliance Decision Framework, in that it basically includes a risk-based approach to compliance management, where depending on the level of risk associated with a non-compliance, it would influence sort of the level of response. So in that compliance decision framework, there's what's called the compliance continuum, where at one end of the spectrum, there's assist, educate, those forms trying to get somebody into compliance, tending towards the other side of the spectrum where you might be compelling or enforcing as the risk of non-compliance gets higher. So that would be the modernization, would be applying a risk-based approach where you're putting your emphasis where the greatest risk would be.
Tab 7 in Canada's Book of Documents, which is Exhibit 673 now, which is up on the screen. This is something that Ms. Tesoro asked you some questions about. And I'd just like to flesh out a couple of things, if I may. First, as we turn to page 2 of the document, there's reference under the second bullet to the role of both Habitat Management and CMP in habitat compliance activities and decisions. And I realize we're on monitoring at the moment, but it's there. This is a document you wrote, as I recall.
I wrote this PowerPoint presentation. Yes.
That's what I mean.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you just, in brief, say and explain the role of Habitat Management and CMP in compliance?
Sure. Within the national protocol, in terms of roles and responsibilities, the national protocol identifies who would be the lead under those various compliance management activities. For many of the activities such as education, promotion, evaluation, most of those, the lead falls to Habitat. The clear, separation is that when it comes to compel and enforce, that would be the role of CMP.
All right. And there is a national protocol about that as well, which has been now made Exhibit 657 and is also at Canada's tab 12. And I may come back to that. Continuing with the document we're in, though, Mr. Carter, if you look at page 3 of this deck, the second bullet there says modernizing the approach really doesn't change the manner in which DFO approaches compliance. Can you just elaborate on that? There are some changes, but at the same time, that's saying that it's not a completely different from what was before.
That's correct. And I mean, this deck was presented within this region, sort of explaining things or pointing things out. And in this region, there's there has been a good working relationship between the CMP staff and the Habitat staff in terms of collaborating on these. And, I think as the previous panel put out, that, this region already has been trying to emphasize, and work on issues of greatest concern or higher risk. So there's already been some of that approach incorporated into sort of compliance management in the region. So this document, I think, put in black and white some of those things that were already occurring in this region.
All right. If you turn to page 7, it there sets out the kinds of monitoring, the types of monitoring, and
Well, 2 of the 3, yes.
yes, right. So it doesn't include the fish habitat health monitoring.
That's correct.
And there's the 3 types, compliance, effectiveness, and fish habitat health.
That's correct.
Can you explain, and we can also, at the same time, if it's possible, to bring up on the screen alongside this tab 15, I think it is, of the Commission's binder. Yes, 15, which is now Exhibit 676. Can you explain how and in what stage fashion DFO in this region is going about developing its monitoring strengths?
I think you can see from the PowerPoint presentation on the left that, in terms of compliance monitoring, that's currently what we're doing, and that was the emphasis of last year.
So that's the leftmost set of columns there?
Yeah, under types of monitoring.
Yeah.
And then in terms of effectiveness monitoring, that's something that we are building foundations and tools to do, but that wasn't our main focus, and that we're working with science on that.
And that's the medium,
Yes.
the middle column on the right side of the screen.
Exactly.
And then next?
Then in the longer term, and this is in the national document, you're looking at science development of ecosystem indicators to determine whether cumulative effects or other ecosystem level issues are being addressed. So, and that's in the sort of the 4 or 5 year term as identified in the national document.
All right, and we can see, and you just referenced some of it, we can see the years when you're going to be doing the various monitoring. You're doing the compliance monitoring now, and you're starting to move to the effectiveness monitoring, are you?
Well, or development of the tools to do it.
All right.
Right, and then obviously there has to be a fair amount of engagement with science in the development of those tools.
All right. And we can probably, without losing the left side of the screen completely, because we'll come back to it, but we can focus on the right side of the screen. And there's a second page to the right side of the screen, Exhibit 676. And Ms. Tessero took you to this as well. Am I correct that what this page is trying to do is show pictorially the level of involvement of different branches within fisheries in the various stages or steps in your monitoring rollout?
Yeah, the 3 groups, the CNP, the habitat, and the science, yes.
And it appears from this that science has got a very heavy component when it comes to effectiveness monitoring and fish habitat health.
That would be correct.
And can you briefly describe what is underway now to ready things so that science will have the time and the resources to do this big pink box that's here?
Well, a couple of things. There are things going on regionally. There have been a set of guidelines developed for a specific type of project that science is being asked to peer review the monitoring methodology outlined in those guidelines. So there is some regional work being done on developing, effects monitoring or effectiveness monitoring that would be done by proponents mainly. So there is some engagement with science there regionally, and at the national level, there have been meetings that have gone on between Habitat and science, looking at what the sort of science priorities for the next 5 years might be. And my understanding is that some of that those indicators or standards have been identified as a priority for science.
All right. If we turn now to tab 12 in Canada's binder, which is Exhibit 657, this is the national protocol as between habitat and conservation and protection. You're familiar with this document, are you?
Yes, I am.
Are there any aspects of this document that are important to point to as they bear on your work and the work of your unit?
Well, I guess the one piece in this document, it does identify that monitoring is a responsibility of Habitat, though there is support from CMP in that. Beyond that, there's not a lot because this document mainly refers to compliance management.
Okay.
So,
Ms. Tesoro asked you early on in her questions about why monitor, and you gave an answer, which I took to be the start of an answer, and then the questions and answers moved on to some other points. And in answering Ms. Tesero's question, you said that in answer to why monitor, one thing is to support compliance, and you also said to continuously shoot for improvement. Are there other reasons that you think are important to list for the Commissioner as to why monitor habitat?
well, I mean, those two are the main ones, I think, that you're supporting the compliance to ensure or elevate the levels of compliance and avoid impacts to habitat. So I guess through higher rates of compliance, the hope is that you're avoiding impacts to fish habitat, which would be in tune with the policy. And then, yes, I mean, the continuous improvement and evaluation of the work that we're doing and how effective it is and how can we improve the effectiveness, I think those really are the two key issues.
Okay. If we could turn now to Exhibit 679, which is tab 16 in the Commissioner's binder. This is another PowerPoint presentation. It's from November of 2010, and in answering Ms. Tesero's questions, I understand that this is something you authored.
Yes.
And this is a PowerPoint that sets out some of the preliminary findings of your 2010 fieldwork.
Yes. Very preliminary findings.
And as I understand it, 2010 was your first operational year, if I could put it that way.
Where there were staff in all areas doing monitoring, yes.
So you've now got a region-wide set of data that you are taking in hand, assembling and analyzing, I gather.
That's correct.
And I think you indicated that there will be a final report on the results of your 2010 work.
There will be a regional report, yes.
And that's at the point where you indicated if you weren't here, you'd be doing that.
Yes.
With that, though, do you have an estimate when that will be done and available?
It will be done this spring, I would hope within the next couple of months.
All right, so by summer, roughly.
Yep.
On page 6, you've got percentages there for the findings, the results, by yes, no, in terms of compliance,
Yes.
partial, unknown, and the last one's not applicable, I take it.
Right.
What's meant by partial? Does partial mean they met it a little bit or complied a little bit, or does it mean substantial compliance, or can you just elaborate on what's
We
referred
answered
to?
those questions in a very specific fashion in order to ensure that people were answering them in a consistent manner. So, you know, there might have been a series of conditions associated with a particular project. If they met one of those conditions and they didn't meet the rest, we would have said partial. If they met all of the conditions, we would have said yes. If they met none of the conditions, we would have said no. So we were very specific in how we approached the answering to those questions.
All right, so we know then from this information, recognizing it's very preliminary data, but
Yeah.
as it stands, we know that, for example, in terms of built as proposed, about 44% complied.
Well, sorry, we're built as proposed.
Yes, if I said something different, you've kindly corrected me. But 44% built as proposed, and then another 16% had some level of compliance, but we don't know what level of
Again,
compliance?
we're going to direct you away from using the term compliance.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were, basically, I guess it would have been, what is it, almost 70% were built as proposed. But that doesn't, because they were built as proposed or not built as proposed, that's somewhat distinct from whether they were compliant with the act or not.
Yes, yes, I take your point from earlier. I think it's been said, but to be clear, all of the work that you're doing is monitoring of projects, right?
Yes,
So it's project-based.
that's correct.
And at the very end of questioning from Ms. DeCero, she asked you about the links or connection between WSP indicators and work there, or whether you were using any of that information. As I understand it, the WSP work is watershed-based as opposed to project-based.
Or conservation unit based, so
Yes.
stock based. I should clarify, I guess there is some work that we are doing, some inventory work that is somewhat distinct from project assessment, so things like the shoreline monitoring that was done on Shuswap, things like that, but the bulk of it is all project directed. And you're correct that WSP is more of a conservation unit approach.
So you're doing something different.
Well, we're doing more project monitoring as opposed to ecosystem or conservation unit monitoring.
Right.
That doesn't mean that that couldn't be incorporated into our monitoring efforts in the future, but currently the main focus of our monitoring efforts are project-based.
All right. And with the projects that you do monitor, and I gather you looked at about 614 last year,
Yes.
how do you
Well,
select?
actually, 614 site visits. The number of actual projects would be lower because some of the projects involved more than one site visit.
Okay. And how do you select which sites to go to?
We actually looked at sort of selection of sites in 3 different approaches. We did some monitoring that we referred to as routine monitoring, where we did random samples. We did random samples of authorizations, random samples of letters of advice regionally. And then we also did some monitoring that we would have termed as strategic monitoring, where we directed monitoring efforts at specific types of projects or specific activities. So we did monitoring on seawall developments, and we would have done a sample of seawalls. We did monitoring of docks in the interior. We did monitoring of clear span bridge crossings, and those would have been strategic projects. So for a particular project type, we would have done a random sample, but within that project type, so a stratified sample. And then thirdly, we did a certain amount of targeted monitoring, which was strictly risk-based monitoring, where somebody identified a concern or identified an issue where they felt monitoring should be applied, more from maybe a compliance management perspective, where we did some targeted monitoring as well. So 3 different approaches to monitoring.
In terms of that last group, the targeted monitoring, would that be based on one or both of the particular project or activity has a high risk, sort of a well-known high risk to it, and or the particular proponent has a reputation or...
It could have been compliance risk, or it could have been impact risk, you're right.
And in terms of the strategic monitoring, how did you pick the particular kinds of things you looked at? You mentioned stream crossings and seawalls and so forth. How did you pick those versus others?
Prior to doing our work planning for last year, we identified a number of priorities, and we tried to integrate national priorities, regional priorities, and priorities that were identified in the various areas. So we actually met with staff or section heads and looked for them to provide us with things that they felt monitoring efforts should be directed towards. Those priorities were identified, and then we used those priorities to include specific projects within our work plan. So things like clear span bridges and docks were identified as priorities, and that's why there was monitoring effort directed towards those.
Was there a conscious determination made to divide up the sites that you looked at between what I'll call large projects and small projects?
No, we broke it down more by regulatory tool. So we looked at authorizations, which might involve large projects or small projects. We looked at letters of advice. Again, they might be large or small. So it was more by the regulatory tool rather than the size of the project.
And then in result, you have in your data collected monitoring information on a range of size of projects.
Yes.
And do you know what the split between large and small is in rough terms?
I'm sorry, I don't.
That's fine.
That would be something I could look up, but it's something I don't have at the top of my head.
Oh, that's fine. Now, we've already covered that there are the three kinds of monitoring, and you're at the first stage, the compliance monitoring, and that's what we've just talked about for the last few moments. Are you on target to move along that time continuum that we saw in the picture chart that we went to?
We're definitely working on building some of the tools to do the effectiveness monitoring. I think we're dependent on some support from science, and I can't, I expect that support will come, but I can't say for sure. So I think we're moving in that direction. I think that timeline of fully implementing effectiveness monitoring and then ecosystem is ambitious. Just knowing how much effort is involved in getting solid information that's gathered consistently.
And that's up to 2013, isn't it?
Yes. So I think we're moving in the right direction.
All right. Are steps being taken to have science become available to do what you need of them?
Yes, they are.
And what's that?
There is a liaison or a person involved in sort of working with science within Pacific Region that I have opportunity to communicate with and get priorities to. There's also national engagement between Habitat and Science that has been ongoing. There have been meetings that have occurred between the two groups. So,
what sort of work will science be doing? What's needed of them?
We definitely need support when it comes to effectiveness monitoring in terms of, number of sites, how many replicates, how to sample, which specific variables to gather, which would be the most indicative of change. So there's definitely support from science in the design of the sampling regime or the monitoring regime. And, in Pacific Region, because of WSP, when it comes to the ecosystem health indicators, a number of those have already been developed. So those indicators have been developed, but again, there's the need to develop sort of a framework for applying those indicators. You might have a specific indicator, but how many sites within a watershed do you need to sample to accurately represent what's going on in that watershed? Do you need to look at 100 or do you need to look at 1,000? So.
Returning for a moment to WSP, are you involved in developing a framework for how monitoring may be done in relation to WSP?
I have been involved in the development of that framework, which is ongoing.
And what is your involvement?
I've just been a reviewer. I guess that is work that's being done by an outside contractor, so I have been asked to review the work that's been done currently and to provide some advice.
Okay. Does compliance monitoring play a role in identifying habitat violations that might warrant enforcement action?
Yes, it would.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, through compliance monitoring, we would identify occurrences, which are circumstances where an unauthorized harm to fish habitat has occurred. Those occurrences are basically non-compliance with the Fisheries Act. Then the next question becomes, how do you respond to that occurrence? And that's where that compliance decision framework comes into play. If it was deemed that the compliance risk was high, i.e. maybe the cooperation of the proponent was low, or there was a previous history of non-compliance, and the level of impact was high, that would be something that would likely be, if you followed the direction within that compliance decision framework, something that would be recommended for enforcement action.
So if there is something found that's identified as a problem and a recommendation made, who does that go to? Who sends what to who?
Well, through the monitoring unit, we would do the monitoring. If we identified an occurrence, we would then refer that information to the habitat biologist involved in that file, and then they would work with their CMP staff in their area to make a decision about the level of compliance risk and how to proceed with that.
All right. If we could turn to tab 18 in the Commission's binder. I think we might have mentioned this earlier. This is now Exhibit 678. You're familiar with this document.
Yes, I am.
And I think you said you wrote it.
With a lot of help.
All right. And it sets out, does it, the way that habitat monitoring in the region will work and the goals and the objectives of it?
It does.
Okay. Is there anything in this document that you think important to underline for the commissioner?
I think the goal is fairly key. And, you know, the primary goal of habitat monitoring in Pacific region is to increase the amount and quality of information available through compliance, effectiveness, and fish habitat monitoring to support the continuous improvement in current habitat management approaches.
And that's in aid of what?
That's in aid of meeting, I guess, the habitat policy of avoiding or minimizing losses of fish habitat.
All right. Have you got any recommendations to do with monitoring or suggestions that you think are important to leave with the commissioner for his consideration?
I guess a key thing is it will be important to build a solid foundation, that all of these various forms of monitoring are important to do, and the compliance monitoring, the effectiveness monitoring, and the ecosystem health monitoring. I think it's key that a strong foundation gets built so that the information that's gathered is sound and that good decisions can be made based upon sound and defensible information. I think it's also important to recognize that there's a number of parties potentially involved in that. There's follow-up monitoring from proponents that, if gathered in a very standard fashion and, you know, under a certain set of parameters, could be used to support that, as well as entities outside the department, such as, you know, non-governmental organizations, streamkeepers. There's a number of parties that could play a role in this. So, but it's key that a strong foundation be built, and that, like as I said, that the information gathered is sound.
And I take when you say foundation, you mean a collection of data and information that's then kept and can be used as a baseline and for reference.
Exactly, and that it's gathered in a consistent and defensible manner.
All right. Are there other suggestions that you have?
No, I think that's the main one.
All right. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Ted, I just have a couple of just quick points that came out of the evidence that you elicited from the witness during your examination. You asked him about how much staff time was spent, and he said the goal was 20% on monitoring. But he said in reality it's in the neighborhood of 5%. I wonder if he could just explain what is happening with staff when they're not monitoring. In other words, if they're doing 5% instead of 20%, what makes up the difference?
Sure. The reality is, and I think it came out in the discussions with the previous panel, a lot of work is drawn up into the referral side of it and the project review side of it. And there's been a lot of effort done by the program to triage those referrals, to try and prioritize them and ensure that time's being spent on the most important. Part of the reason for doing that triage and that prioritization is to try and free up time to do other things such as monitoring. But the referrals do chew up a lot of time. So, well, just summing up on that, so is this part of the age-old saying that the immediate overtakes the important sometimes? Yes.
All right.
And just one other question that came out of the evidence. You talked about the development, science developing indicators, ecosystem indicators.
Yes.
And you also talked about the wild salmon policy and the ecosystem-based approach there.
Yes.
Are you talking about national science developing indicators for ecosystem that would be used within the wild salmon policy, or are you talking about two different sets of indicators?
Hopefully not. I think that, you know, if you look at that national framework diagram, it does talk about indicators. I guess one key thing to point out is that the indicators under wild salmon policy are specific to salmon populations, whereas at a national you might be developing indicators that would have to deal with more species under different situations. So,
I see.
yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Those are my questions.
Mr. Commissioner, I have Mr. Harrison with a 30-minute estimate.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Good morning, Mr. Carter. My name is Judah Harrison, for the record, HARRISON, and I represent the Conservation Coalition, which is a group of non-governmental organizations, and Mr. Otto Langer, who I believe you know. I will be sticking to my time estimate this time for certain. So I only have actually only a few questions for you. Over the last 2 days, which I believe you were here for, the witnesses, including Ms. Reed, discussed the fact that Habitat staff were losing their investigative powers, or there was a decision taken to remove investigatory powers from Habitat staff and to place them only with CNP staff. Am I right in that?
Are you referring to inspector's designation?
Well, yes, I guess so, because I thought, yes, inspection powers is what I understood it to be. So if it is inspection designation, that could be it.
I am aware of that. It does relate to the national protocol that has been revised, sort of clarifying the role of CMP and Habitat with regards to enforcement. Inspector's designation has to do with Section 36 in terms of deleterious substances. And having inspector status, one of the things that it does provide is the opportunity to provide an inspector's direction. The national protocol, as it's been revised, has identified that CNP would be the body that would issue those inspectors' directions rather than Habitat staff.
So has it had any impact on the ability of your staff to collect evidence, for instance?
The intent under the national protocol, my understanding is that staff would still be designated as fisheries guardians. So under the fisheries guardian status, you would still have the opportunity to trespass if necessary. You would have that protection, and to gather information in support of monitoring. So with guardian status, the monitoring staff or staff would still be able to gather that sort of information.
Okay, and I guess, do you have an opinion as to whether removal of those powers from Habitat or clarifying that those powers only belong to CMP, do you have an opinion of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing?
I do have an opinion. I think that, taking the inspector status from Habitat staff does have the potential to create some challenges, because one of the things about being able to issue an inspector's, if you have inspector's status, one of your authorities is the ability to issue an inspector's direction, and that would be under Section 38 of the Act, where you could direct somebody to take action to avoid the deposition of deleterious substance. If CMP officers are the only ones empowered with issuing those directions, I guess there is the potential where using that as a preventative measure could become a little bit more challenging. It would just mean, though I think it could be dealt with, it would just mean there'd have to be more collaboration between Habitat staff and CMP staff to ensure that the right person was on site when that kind of a direction needed to be provided. So there's some potential for some workload issues and some challenges.
And on that note, can you describe generally the working relationship and collaboration between Habitat staff and CMP? And specifically, is there the equivalent of joint work plans, or is there meetings to discuss collaboration and stuff like that?
Yes, there is. There do tend to be meetings discussing sort of joint efforts, working together, collaboration on compliance management, identifying priorities, Habitat identifying priorities for CMP. So that type of working relationship does exist. One of the things, though, in this region is the working relationship between CMP and Habitat. I guess there has to be there is some flexibility amongst the areas, because the activities of CMP staff vary between the areas, and that's why, if you look at the protocol, there's a national protocol, there's a regional protocol, which is that roles and responsibilities, and then within this region, there's also area operational plans. And the reason for those area operational plans was that there's differences in CMP's responsibilities. Some areas have year-round fisheries, other areas have seasonal fisheries, so the availability of CMP staff to be involved in Habitat issues can be changeable amongst the areas, so that's why there's the area operational plans. But the working relationships generally are pretty good. So.
Okay, thank you. In your earlier evidence this morning, you said that compliance monitoring is limited to projects that have obtained a HAD authorization or to reviewing or that have obtained letters of advice. Is that correct?
Or that provided a notification under an operational statement.
So, using a term that Ms. Tesoro used, for a high school student, on the level of high school student, if you came across if one of your staff came across a blatant habitat, a blatant occurrence of a habitat destruction, but that has not been authorized and no advice has been given with respect to that, what would they do?
Obviously, I mean, they would act as a habitat biologist and they would collect information about that particular situation. And one of the things they would do is, I think, initially identify whether it was a project that had been reviewed and was acting under a regulatory, instrument, or whether it was not. And then they would likely make the area biologist of that area aware of the situation. So collect the information and make the correct individual aware of it. Right? They may well even refer it to CMP if it was something that where they felt an investigation was warranted. Right?
So it's really about choosing at the front end to choose where you go. You're only going to choose to go to spots that have been authorized or obtained letters of advice. Is that?
Well, when it comes to the monitoring that we've been doing, where we're looking at evaluating our activities, then yes, we're basing that monitoring on where we've provided advice or provided direction. Yes.
We will now adjourn until 2 o'clock.